Okay, well today we're going to review the final exam. Hope you have learned some good things about C++, and the exam will have 100 questions. It will open on May 1st at about 12:15. You will have 2 hours to complete it. You're going to need to know about pointers, how to declare pointers, how to use pointers, how to do pointer arithmetic, how to declare dynamic variables and arrays using pointers, what would be the purpose of using a dynamic array and when you would choose to do so, what happens when you delete or free pointers, you need to know what an ADT is, which stands for abstract data type, how you make one, how you use one. You need to know the basics of constructing classes and declaring constructors for classes, how you make default constructors and also various types of constructors that take arguments. You need to know when to use the public and private labels, the defaults for using public, or the defaults for whether something is public or private in classes and structures. You need to know what mutators and accessors do and why they're important when you use private data members. When you would use the const modifier with classes. How to write the definitions for class functions, including the use of the scope resolution operator. How to overload operators, such as the extraction operation, the insertion operation, the plus, minus, asterisk, slash operations. You should be familiar with the include, define, and endif precompiler directives and what we use them for. Using header files in your own user-defined ADT. You need to be familiar with namespaces, what namespaces standard libraries use, how to make and use your own namespaces. You need to be familiar with stacks, queues, linked lists, the characteristics of those, including the very simplest single linked nodes, lists, and so forth. You need to know how recursion works. And that's related to stacks, as we discussed before. You'll need to be able to interpret code and figure out what results it will produce. You need to know about the special problems that can occur when you have dynamic memory allocation in a class, and the extra things that you have to use with constructors and destructors and so forth. Separate compilation, be familiar with that, how that works, the strategies that you need. Be familiar with recursive cases and stopping or base cases, stopping conditions for recursive definitions. Let's see. In addition to the using namespace directive, be familiar with other ways that you can bring in identifiers from various namespaces. You should also be familiar with the arrow operator, what it does, how it works. You need to remember how to do a static cast in order to typecast from one type to another. You need to remember how to append to an output file that previously had data in it already. You're going to need to remember how to do array processing for fixed arrays in addition to dynamic arrays. You should remember the various style rules that we learned. Remember the break statement and what various functions it can be used for. Remember call by value and call by reference parameters and when and why you would use them. Remember how to use arrays with functions. The source of the memory for a dynamic variable. So basically you would need to remember dynamic variables are created from the free store or heap at runtime. I mentioned the structure data type. You also need to remember the interface and implementation files for a class and what is contained in each part. You should remember the names of the various operators or know where to look them up. So the address of operator, the dereferencing operator, the multiplication operator, the increment operator. The difference between a unary operator and a binary operator. You should be familiar with what a memory leak is and how it could happen with dynamically allocated memory. You should be familiar with the Boolean compound logical operations and or not, and how they work with short circuit evaluation. You should be familiar with the various problems that can occur commonly in code, such as the off by one error, you should remember pseudocode and flowcharts, how they're used in the programming process. Arguments and parameters and what the difference is between them, how they work together. You should be familiar with the C-string functions, how they're used and what they can tell you. You should be familiar with the concept of inheritance and the terms that go along with that. Parent-child classes, base place classes, derived classes. You should know how to correctly call a base class operation from a derived class operation if you needed to do that. How various objects can be stored or used. So the relationship between the parent and the child class and how those work with functions that are expecting one or the other. Which way can it be used and which way can it not be used. And you should be familiar with how inheritance works between base and derived classes with either public or private functions. You should also be familiar with polymorphism and how C++ implements polymorphism. You should be familiar with the try and catch error handling mechanism, both specific error catches and the generic or default error catching statement. You should know what will happen in case of an unhandled exception and how to verify that your code can handle it. And you need to know when it's appropriate to use exception handling. And you should be familiar with how inheritance is used with classes that are thrown as exception types. You should be familiar with templates, functions, how to create them, how to use them, how to call them. You should also be familiar with class templates and how those are created and used. And you need to know how the compiler compiles different versions of a class template into your program based on how you use it in your code. You should remember what the various parts of a computer are, input and output devices, CPU, main memory, secondary memory, and so forth. You should remember how to write loops of various kinds and how to construct appropriate Boolean expressions to control those loops. You should be able to find the historic figures that contributed to the computers that we know today. And if you know all of that, you should do fine on the final exam. I wish you luck, and I'm sure if you have properly prepared, you'll do fine.